And with us we have Henry David Thoreau, who has apparently found his way back from his original time. He lived from 1817 to 1862. And while we were off camera between shows, we had a great conversation with our friend Sandra Roble, and talking about a lot of things and a lot of observations about Salem, Massachusetts, which she's been to many times, and not too far from Walden Pond in Massachusetts. And but what I'm most interested in, Mr. Thoreau, is what are some of the notable people that you've observed when you poked in and out of our time over the last 50 years, during my lifetime and during my good friend Robert Garavel's lifetime?
Well, I think of 3 or 4 that come to mind. I would have to really put almost at the top of the list Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And then I would also like to include Cesar Chavez, who was the
United Farm Workers,
the United Farm Workers, a staunch representative and their president for years, and a good representation of decency and civility. And also John Lennon.
John Lennon, okay.
Whose lyrics, in a way, mirror my philosophy, or maybe vice versa. But his lyrics seem to have somewhat of a pontification for decency and civility, and social justice. I'm thinking of his song there, Imagine all the people living life in peace, imagining no possessions,
no country.
These are all very provocative and thought-provoking concepts that are considered probably lofty by people today, but certainly have some realm of substance in what he's trying to convey.
I often wonder, because now he's been gone for just a little over 30 years since he was killed, and I often wonder if maybe he might be doing the same thing that you're doing, and peeping back in and observing things. And
well, I'm sure maybe he is, along with Dr. King, who was not only a very big advocate of civil rights, that's an all-encompassing issue for basically non-Caucasians.
Yep.
He was much more than that. He was a very big advocate of fairness, economic not equality as such, economic democracy, economic justice, and a very big proponent of protecting the environment.
Yes. Who else besides Dr. King and John Lennon?
Dr. King, John Lennon. And I would take as an aggregate the people today that are involved with reforming the system of politics, if this can be done. More timely, the people that are involved with protests that are against oppression. I would take them as an aggregate of people that I truly admire.
Have you poked yourself into to looking at what's going on in Wall Street, the Occupation Wall Street movement?
I see a group of people that have young people and people that are very, very frustrated and very aggravated with the system of vast, not only economic inequality, but oppression, where people in these corporations are making tremendous amounts of money at the expense of workers. Workers are being laid off from their jobs, while the remaining people on the upper echelon of these corporations are either being paid exorbitant amounts of money or are being asked to retire with exorbitant packages. Simultaneously, people are being laid off. If you go to other countries, corporations are there in countries where they're paying people a substandard wage under very harsh conditions. To equate that to my basic tenet is predicated on a statement I made in front of a group of people at Concord, Massachusetts. Yet the truly efficient laborer will not crowd his day with work, but rather will go through his day surrounded by a wide halo of comfort and care and do what he or she does best.
It sounds like that's a balance of doing what's necessary to do your job,
right?
But doing it within the framework of being a human being.
It's humanizing the workforce and not dehumanizing them. Now, because the workforce has become so bureaucratic and so there are more complexities to it, there needs to be organization. That's where you really have to promote democratic unions, organizations that will represent the welfare of not only the workers, but their families and the environment.
That seems to be the problem that people find with the trade agreements that have been signed, the international trade agreements, is that there's no equity in terms of workers' rights and workers being treated fairly between one country and another, and there's no equality in terms of environmental regulations from one country. So other countries can have a lower standard of environmental protection, make a product cheaper, and gain an advantage over other countries that are more environmentally sensitive.
It's an approach from a two-pronged position. People in America have evolved into liking and being addicted to cheap products. But a bigger part of that picture, too, is that the heads of these corporations and these big businesses are really not doing it for the altruistic wants and desires of the American public, but they're doing it for their own self-motivated and selfish interest, a lot of them. And that is to centralize profits in the pockets of a few. Because of cheap labor in other countries.
And who does that harm in the process?
That harms the people that are working in these countries. You can say, well, at least they're getting a job. We have to go beyond at least. We have to provide these people with jobs where we provide them with a livable wage, and also in regarding the environment, there has to be staunch restrictions on undermining the environment.
I think everybody would pretty much agree that there's some disagreement, obviously, in terms of where we are environmentally.
We've outsourced our economic industrial base here in this country to other countries. A problem that has evolved since the dissolution of the agrarian society that we once so beloved. And this is just an evolution that was almost unstoppable.
Would it be harmful to go back to an agrarian society where basically we're a culture of mostly farming and feeding ourselves?
It had a lot of merits to it, and it certainly made for a more egalitarian sense. Not that we're always going to have total equality, but there certainly was, in that period, more of a communal sense of promoting products that were not only good for the welfare of communities, but distributing wages and profits and the product in a fairer manner. Was
life tougher back then? Wasn't it? People talk about life being tougher back,
well, as you know,
during those days.
There was the mortality rate was a lot lower than it is now. I mean, I lived to I didn't see 50 years of age. I was 44 when I died. Society's made great advances in medical technology. Also has made great advances in medical fraud, tied into the money system and the insatiable want for money. So there's a moral issue too that has evolved, which is really warping the soul of America and other parts of the world, I might say.
Has the quality of life suffered as the quantity of life has expanded?
Well, it's often been said it's not the quantity of years you live, it's a quality. So that could be a philosophical debate that we really don't have time for here.
That's something to think about, certainly for the audience to think about. We have a question from the audience, and it's a little bit off topic, but I think, having been at Walden Pond the better part of your life, it's probably something you've thought a lot about. The question from the audience is, what's your favorite season of the year?
Well, David, that's a good question. I would have to say all the seasons are my favorite. And that's based on the fact that I've derived a certain amount of pleasure out of each and every one of them. They've all been replenishing to me. I would take great enjoyment out of watching the ice form in the crystals on the lake in the winter, as I would enjoy the solemnity of the winter and the transition thereafter into spring. I was afforded ample opportunity to see each and every one of these seasons come in and the merits and beauty of each season. As the winter evolved with some of its harshness, I would often think, in my journal I wrote, we are hunters pursuing the summer on snowshoes and skates all winter long. There really is but one season in our hearts. So in that, I'm saying, when I was a little boy, it was a great pleasure for me to go out sledding and trampling through the woods and playing with my friends in the snow. Mm-hmm. These are the joys of children that unfortunately are diminished as people grow older. That really shouldn't be. They should be an integral part of our life, maintaining an intimacy with the four seasons throughout the year.
Maintaining our contact with nature is what you're saying as an adult, not just leaving it behind,
right,
along with what have been referred to in literature as childish things.
I think there's a danger in detaching yourself too far. And I might say voluntarily, that's a very fine line, because I've often said it's hard for people that are incapacitated and immobilized to really fully enjoy nature. But if you can sit by your window and still listen to the rain beat coming down, and that is your limitation, it's still developing that communion.
Have you had the opportunity to travel elsewhere besides your native New England in your travels since your departure?
I have been to Maine in my life. I have been to Cape Cod, but I would often think that traveling is something that is an inward experience. I was approached once by a journalist at Walden, and he asked, Henry, do you travel? You seem to be here all the time. And I responded, I do a lot of traveling in my own backyard. And I think there's a lot of validity to that. There's no two scenes that are exactly the same in my own backyard. There's a tremendous amount to observe in the capacity of my own backyard. By that I mean in the proximity of where I can walk to. And that's what I prided myself on. With the invention of the railroad, and as we came further, the car, jets, people had this desire, once again, that was pressed on them by the media to travel. And this all became part of their desires.
So spiritually, you could go to Santa Barbara, you could go to Miami Beach, but you choose to stay in your native New England?
There's much to be seen, David. There's too much if I could spend my entire life. I mean, we had foliage that you do not have today. There was always a change in formation in the skyscape, the landscape, the animals that I observed. And I chronicled a lot of these things and put them into Texas. So, no, there was never a period of time where I felt there was a lack of things for me to appreciate in nature. People have a misconception that I was a loner and that I was somewhat of a hermit. I'd like to clarify that I really wasn't. I enjoyed talking with people. I became somewhat frustrated when the talk turned to solely monetary pursuits. And people engaged in demonstrative behavior on their wealth. That I found to be very shallow.
Oh, ostentatious type of behavior.
Ostentatious.
Flashing their jewelry, so to speak.
Right. I would be very much engaged with people that were into philosophy. As you know, my mentor, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who would tour the country and lecture basically on the East Coast, and we had Harrison Blake, and then you might remember the noted poet Emily Dickinson, who I was very fond of. Were engaged in a higher form of what we called at the time transcendental meditation. You've heard this word?
Yeah, and I'm hearing a little bit of Buddhism in what you're saying too, but certainly transcendental meditation.
There was a tie-in with Buddhism and Hinduism, and a great deal of belief that the manifestation of God is seen in nature, and therein lies our principles for spirituality. I did record in my journal, if we are to learn the true virtues of nature, then we will practice more humanity to others. And now, people are a little perplexed by that. I would ask them if they could sit and observe the beauty of nature. It would add to the well-being of their moral views, in realizing that what I see and what I experience in front of me is not something I need to buy or purchase or engage in wars on to preserve. There seems to be a lot of emphasis today on solving problems through the end of a gun. And why is this? If you look at it from a deep point of view, it's not only for the perpetuation of what we call national security, but it is also for a perpetuation of a lifestyle that we have become enamored to. That calls for this insatiable consumption of goods at the expense of not only pursuing our wants and desires on an individual basis, but also the nation state. John Lennon said, imagine, I think I mentioned this early, imagine no country. So if we had an international response to the real crises of the times, then we would collectively resolve them. But it doesn't really seem to be the case. Today we have organizations like the UN, and we have the United States, which is the major military power in, some people refer to them as a major force of police action in other countries. There has to be not that unilateral approach. You have to have a democratic, functioning, representative United Nations that could intervene and resolve conflicts. I might add, too, a concern that I see is the economy in our United States of America is very entrenched in military products. This seems to create a big problem, because then it entrenches the concept of warfare by exporting these military hardware to other countries, and they may not be used for what we call savory purposes. We export arms to Taiwan. Do we know where they go from there? So I think what has to happen in the international community is to convert the military economies so we can be producing recycling technologies, mass transit, which is desperately needed, an end to famine and hunger. These are all lofty, but certainly not unattainable.
You sound very religious in nature, in the sense that you're almost intimating or even saying out loud that the concept of beating swords into plowshares,
which is a biblical expression. I believe in the power of people. People have to believe in themselves. And this is a concept that is hard for people to grasp when they're being told to think otherwise. Once again, I use that word in a very pervasive manner, but unfortunately it's the only one I can think of. The media. The media, which is pulling people in directions that are somewhat more than a distraction to the welfare of not only themselves, but society at large.
We spend a lot of our time in the presence of media, in the presence of television and radio and iPods and iPads and personal computers. We're exposed to that a lot of our day. Probably 100 times more than the time we're exposed to nature. The simplicity of nature that you talked about.
Well, that's why I said if people learn the true secrets of nature by an often visitation, and in that visitation, developing an intimacy with nature, well, that means many things for many people. For some people, it means water skiing on Lake Kenosha. You're getting little bits of it, but once again, you're bringing the technological world onto the lake, which is almost like putting vinegar on ice cream.
That's well said. Vinegar on ice cream, and I guess everybody would probably agree that vinegar on ice cream, vinegar is not really too good on ice cream.
We have to passively accept what nature offers and not add to it with technology that undermines the serenity and beauty of it. I might add that nature can kiss you and it can kick you too.
And how do we enjoy nature when we've got iPods, when we've got the pods, the earbuds in our ear?
Well, if you remember, Dave, going back in this area, a few years ago, we had things called the Blue Laws.
Blue Laws, yeah.
Which really forced the local businesses to put one day aside for religious reasons because Christianity preached that servile work on Sunday was against the tenets of Christianity.
Correct, as Judaism teaches that work on Saturday is
but as Christianity evolved and it became topsy-turvy and the issues became overlapped and interpreted by other people, that law was skirted. And now there is some talk, I believe, that banks may be open on Sunday. So it becomes more of an emphasis on commerce over what we basically need. And I feel quite convinced is more time to not engage in commercial activity.
So you're saying, I guess, the Blue Laws probably served at the very least a useful purpose of providing people with a day where there were certain things that they couldn't do, which gave them the opportunity, if you will, of doing the things that you profess are good things.
Well, it was put aside as a day of rest, and that it wasn't set aside for, if it is a day of rest, that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to put you in jail if you don't go to the beach. What it meant basically was it's a day of non-commercial activity. Basically, there were still some stores that provided essential services, but basically it said it was a day set aside for people not to go shopping. I wrote in my journal, let me go huckleberrying, let me go fishing, anything but shopping on Sunday. So I think for the welfare of society, people have to be given, is it a mandatory? You'll never, I don't think, see that revert to that. But the people in our country have the power to do that if they collectively decide that.
Or even as individuals, self-control.
Individual basis, that can be done. I've heard people say that I don't have time to shop during the week, so I have to do it on Sunday.
Yeah.
Which is, I believe a lot of the stores are open till 9 or 10 o'clock at night.
We're going to have to invite you back because this has been a fascinating conversation, not just for our audience, but for myself also, to learn a little bit about what's going on. Good night from Progressive Soup. Well, We'll have you back. We'll have you back.
I would like to add one last thing, David, if
Yes,
I could.
please.
I am very encouraged to see young people today taking a stance on the inequality that is existing in our society today that goes beyond rewarding people for their success into the area of oppression. I applaud those people that are fighting to end wars, and I applaud them because those are the needed works that are needed to make our society a more cohesive and a more peaceful place to live, and a planet where we can all live in a life of harmony.
Blessed be the peacemakers.
It sounds lofty.
And hopefully that's not, when people say that, hopefully they're not referring to the missiles that are called peacekeepers.
Well, all countries, the major industrial countries in the United States is certainly not exempt from hostile behavior in other countries. If that sounds anti-patriotic, then it is an observation that is based on reality.
Sometimes you have to be more patriotic to what's in your heart than what's than the flag that you live under, if that's an observation I could make.
I think that's a fair statement to make, and I think we have to look of what affects people in Iraq, people in Afghanistan, people in China, and look at the whole picture, as well as what affects people in our country.
And with that, we're going to have you back another day, because this
David,
has been a marvelous experience. Henry David Thoreau, I'm David Stevenson, and good evening from Progressive Soup. Thanks very much for joining us. Good night.